Tom stepped into the dining area of the Atlas spaceship, his mind clouded with anxiety. Despite the fact that this was an exchange mission with a new alien species, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that hung over him. The cold metal walls around him made it feel as though he was trapped in an unfamiliar, sterile world, one that lacked any warmth or comfort. Before him was a strange menu, unlike any food he had ever seen. The only two options displayed, simple to the point of disbelief, were herbivore and carnivore. That was it. No elaborate dishes, no variety of choices as he had expected. The food wasn't cooked. There was no heat, no fire, no delicious aromas or seasonings. Everything was raw and exposed. His unease deepened when he noticed a small plate, piled high with leaves, plants, and raw animal matter. It looked like nothing more than mushy, unprocessed chunks of meat. Tom stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the carnivore choice. What was the meat in that? He could hardly imagine it. The carnivore option wasn't like grilled or stewed meat as he had expected. It was something entirely unfamiliar, a creature, a bizarre amalgamation of animal parts and plant matter. The meat had no clear shape, some of it possibly raw flesh, but it had a faint, unpleasant odor that sent a chill down his spine. The layer of fat on its surface was slick and oily, and the meat itself had an eerie toughness to it. It felt as if he was staring at a living entity, not simple food. He couldn't ignore the unsettling atmosphere around him. The dining room on the spaceship was bathed in dim, cold light, the faint glow from the overhead strips casting a pale, unwelcoming hue. The chill from the metal walls seeped into his very bones, his body tensing with every breath. The air was dry, causing his skin to tighten, and the absence of warmth made the whole place feel oppressive. There was no fire to cook the food, no way to heat anything. Everything about this experience was too uncomfortable. It was this chaotic feeling that made Tom feel like he was trapped in a nightmare. Was this the challenge he had to face in order to complete the mission? The alien species diet, unlike anything he had ever known, might be a much greater challenge than simply exchanging cultures. The food wasn't just a matter of physical survival. It was a battle for life in this strange, mysterious alien space. Tom glanced down at his plate once more, then lifted his head to survey the room. The entire crew of the Atlas seemed unfazed, as if this was the most natural thing in the world for them. But for Tom, everything was turning upside down. He couldn't help but wonder what awaited him ahead when he couldn't rely on the usual human senses and knowledge to solve this problem. Tom swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the plate before him. The carnivore dish he had been instructed to try wasn't like any meat he'd ever encountered. The pieces of meat he expected were now revealed to be a living creature, a grotesque form beyond description. Its body was unlike anything he had studied, a fusion of biological parts that defied the laws of nature Tom had come to understand. Thrawn, the name he'd heard from the alien crew, had now become a haunting, unshakable thought. The creature lacked a defined shape. Instead, its form appeared as a twisted mass of biological fragments, parts of its body that did not connect in any recognizable way. Some segments looked like plant fibers, soft, translucent, and swirling like long threads intertwined with each other. Other parts of it resembled flesh, covered in sharp, jagged scales like the thorns of a deep jungle plant. Its eyes were not eyes at all, but hollow cavities filled with glittering orbs, resembling shards of shattered glass. The odor rising from the creature was indescribable, like something was decaying in the air. A wave of nausea surged in Tom's throat, but he couldn't look away. The unfeeling stares from the alien crew members lingered on him, and Tom knew that rejecting this food would not only mark a personal failure as a member of the crew, but it could also be seen as a betrayal of the mission. Tom slowly reached out and took a piece of the strange meat, feeling its unnatural moisture. As he touched it, the piece seemed to vibrate under his fingers, as if it were still alive, as if its breath lingered in every cell. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he brought it to his mouth, fear rising with every small bite he took. At first, when the meat touched his lips, the sensation was slimy and rubbery, like some viscous substance, almost causing him to recoil. But his resolve held him in place. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The meat began to melt on his tongue, but not in the way food should. It dissolved into his taste buds, numbing his tongue with an unfamiliar tingling. A strange, sour-sweet flavor spread across his senses, leaving him unable to tell whether it was food or some biological mistake, a physiological error of unimaginable proportions. The nausea in him grew stronger as he realized that this meal was not just a taste test, but a struggle for survival. Each bite, no matter how small, felt like a shock to his system, a punch to his gut that rattled his very being. He began to feel a vague sense of unease, as if something was shifting inside his body, a sensation growing more undeniable with every passing second. Tom fought to keep his panic at bay, but as the minutes ticked by, the unsettling changes inside him grew harder to ignore. He couldn't stop thinking about the hidden dangers this food might bring. Was this the turning point he'd been dreading on this journey? Or was he stepping into some kind of dangerous experiment from which there was no return? Tom stared through the window of the Atlas, his eyes hollow as he gazed into the vast, silent expanse of space. The stars twinkled like scattered gems across the sky, but no light was bright enough to dispel the anxiety building within him. The ship's life support system had just sounded an alarm, and he realized with a sinking feeling that the food supply for humans was running dangerously low. The alien crew, though incredibly friendly and hospitable, hadn't fully understood human dietary habits. The crude meals available on the ship were enough for only a few days, and the emergency was rapidly approaching. This scarcity wasn't just a survival test. It was a race against time that Tom couldn't afford to lose. Determined to find something edible, Tom made the choice to leave the ship and step down onto the surface of Xylan, formerly known as Alpha 5. He hoped this planet would offer him the sustenance he desperately needed. The ship's scans and scientific reports had indicated that Xylan had relatively stable ecological conditions, with abundant plant life and animals that could provide food for humans. But as soon as Tom landed on the planet's surface, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The sky wasn't the blue he had expected. It was a pale gray, as though covered by a thick, fog-like cloud. The sunlight was weak, diffused by a dense layer of mist. The air smelled strangely sour and pungent, like a kind of decay he'd never encountered. The surroundings were eerily still, without the vibrant life of animals that he'd imagined. Just strange, towering plants, their stalks high and stiff, with red leaves that looked almost like hardened horns. Tom walked cautiously on the ground, his feet crunching through dense grass, the sound oddly unsettling, as if something was stirring beneath. The further he ventured, the more bizarre the landscape became. The plants seemed to reach upward, stretching toward some unseen source of life. Gigantic insects flew frantically around him, their wings buzzing loudly, but they did not attack. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden power in this place, something wrong, something he couldn't quite place. Suddenly, from far off, he heard a long, piercing screech, like the sound of a howling wind, but it wasn't natural. A sense of unease washed over him, causing him to freeze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, and immediately, the massive creature emerged from the thick underbrush. Killor Beast, a terrifying super predator he couldn't have possibly imagined. It was nearly 3 meters tall, its massive body covered in thick, dark fur. On its head was a giant jaw, wide enough to devour anyone in an instant. Its eyes glowed bright, like balls of fire, glaring at Tom with a deadly, icy intensity. With each step the Killor Beast took, deep imprints were left in the ground, making the earth beneath Tom's feet feel as though it was being pressed down. Its legs were armed with razor-sharp claws, so powerful that every time they touched the ground, they left behind a deafening crash. The creature's long tail lashed through the air, producing a whistling sound like a sharp wind cutting through the atmosphere. Tom could barely breathe, his heart thundering in his chest as if it might burst. He stood there, frozen, only able to feel the cold creeping from his spine down to his legs, as if death were creeping closer with every step. But as the Killor Beast approached, its eyes showed no hint of malice. Instead, they reflected an insatiable hunger, a desperate thirst for prey. In that fleeting moment, Tom sensed the madness in every move of the creature. It wasn't just a predator, it was a perfect instrument of destruction. The worst part was, this creature could sense fear, and it was drawing closer, step by step. Tom knew that he had no choice but to face this beast, and in his mind, only one thing resonated clearly: survival. Tom stood motionless, his eyes locked on the killer beast closing in on him. The creature was not only powerful, but shockingly agile, moving with incredible speed despite its massive, heavy frame. Each of its steps sent vibrations through the ground, making the earth beneath Tom tremble, the force of its footsteps a jarring shock that he could feel all the way to his bones. The killer beast raised its head, its glowing eyes fixed on Tom, as though it were predicting each of his movements. The presence of the creature brought a palpable sense of terror, as if time itself had frozen, and everything around them became a blur of impending death. Its massive jaws parted, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, ready to tear through anything it encountered. Every muscle in Tom's body tensed like a tightened string, his skin prickling as cold sweat dripped down his spine. But there was more than just the killer beast in his field of vision. In a fleeting moment, he noticed someone, watching him from behind. The faint light from the planet reflected off the silhouette of a human figure, half hidden in the shadows. The figure was familiar, and his heart skipped a beat. It was Lyra, a member of the human crew, observing him from a distance, silently following him since he had decided to leave the ship. Her presence was subtle, her movements barely making a sound, as if she were an ethereal shadow slipping between the alien trees. Lyra couldn't help but notice Tom's strange behavior. She had seen him spending an unusual amount of time in the cargo hold of the ship, a place where there was no food suitable for humans. Yet, Tom never ate the plant-based meals provided by the crew. Instead, he secretly brought back something completely alien. Lyra grew increasingly curious and began investigating his peculiar eating habits. On several occasions, she caught glimpses of him sneaking out with raw food that seemed far too strange to be of human origin. It wasn't the kind of food that humans could normally consume. It was alive, unfamiliar, and unsettling. All of it made her feel a sense of deep suspicion. She began to wonder about Tom's true intentions. He claimed to be omnivorous, capable of eating both plants and animals, but was that really the case? Were the foods he consumed truly human, or was he eating things meant for an entirely different life form? As she continued to follow him in the shadows, Lyra realized that these habits weren't just odd, they were hiding something. Tom's diet couldn't be a coincidence. A feeling of unease settled over her. He was hiding something, a deeper purpose, perhaps related to his search for alien life, and it was far more than mere survival. The light from the killer beast caught a part of Lyra's face, making her shiver with a chill that ran through her. Everything around her seemed to blur, and she could see now more clearly than ever that Tom was not just the man she thought she knew. The suspicions, the tension, were building, like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. In that moment, she saw Tom's gaze turn toward her. His look was cold, not the look of a man afraid, but one who was waiting for something. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she had been noticed, that she had been discovered. But just as the killer beast was about to move closer, Tom's movements suddenly stopped, and he faced the creature again, without a trace of fear. Lyra shivered involuntarily, sensing the difference in him. The hidden truths behind Tom's actions were beginning to come into focus, and his existence on this planet seemed to be about more than survival. There was a deeper mystery, something unfathomable, something beyond logic. The cold wind whipped harshly across Tom's face as he reached for his weapon, a primitive bow that he had crafted from materials found on the ship. The sharp arrows gleamed in the faint light of the planet Xylon, sparkling like deadly blades. A sense of control surged through him. All the tension, all the anxiety, melted away, replaced by a strong sense of resolve. The killer beast was closing in, each of its steps leaving deep imprints in the ground. Its fiery eyes seemed to devour the very air, its gaze piercing into Tom as if it were predicting every movement he would make. The creature's massive claws, sharp as knives, dug into the earth with every step, creating a resonating crash that echoed through the stillness of the air. Tom didn't have time to hesitate. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air rush into his lungs, and the tension in his body only grew. The first arrow was drawn back and fired with terrifying speed. The bow shuddered as the arrow shot forward toward the killer beast. The loud twang of the bowstring pierced the air, followed by a whistling screech as the arrow cut through the atmosphere and embedded itself into the creature. The beast halted for a split second, then let out a roar, its voice deafening as the arrow sank deep into its thick hide. Tom knew this was his only chance. He couldn't let the creature get any closer. He aimed again, tightening the string with all his strength, pulling back a second arrow, and releasing it with every ounce of determination. The second arrow shot through the air, heading straight for the killer beast's eye. The creature twisted and howled, thrashing wildly, but it was too late. The bone structure of the beast stiffened as the arrow pierced its eye, and its massive body crumpled to the ground with a resounding crash. Dead, Tom stood there, panting heavily, his hands trembling as he gripped the bough like a lifeline. Though he had won, a strange sense of loneliness washed over him. The suffocating feeling crept into his mind as he realized he couldn't stop now. In that moment, he felt a profound loss, not just because the beast was dead, but because of the alienation that was slowly creeping over him. With cold, silent eyes, the crew members of the Atlas began to turn away. The confrontation with death had somehow made them genuinely fear him. Those who had been friendly and hospitable to him before now avoided him. Doubtful glances passed over him each time he walked by. No one spoke, but the distance was palpable, like an invisible wall growing between him and them. They saw him as strange, a creature they couldn't understand, a human they had never encountered before, someone not only fighting to survive, but with secrets they could not explain about his instincts and biological nature. The food he consumed, the choices he made, all of it seemed to distance him from them. Tom turned back to look at the dead beast, its vacant eyes staring up at him in challenge. He couldn't understand why his actions had caused such fear. Was his survival really costing him this much isolation? Every step he took on the ship now felt like a battle not just for survival, but against the growing alienation from his own crew. In that moment, Tom realized that his existence on this ship wasn't just a fight for survival against the killer beast or the lack of food. It was a battle with himself, with actions, decisions, and secrets he couldn't share. These relationships may have been broken forever, and now he was left alone in a silent space, filled with distance and coldness. Tom stood in the temporary storage room of the ship, the faint glow from the LED lights casting shadows on the bags of smoked meat and jerky he had prepared from the killer beast. The lingering smell of smoke still hung in the air, reminding him of the freshness of his victory, even if it was a victory of the personal kind. The pieces of meat had now hardened, but they were filled with strength and life. Each piece felt like a leap forward in his long journey, from overwhelming fear to survival in this strange, perilous world. The jerky was cut with precision, each piece of smoked meat carefully packed into makeshift wrappings, where Tom felt as though he had crossed a boundary, overcoming a challenge far beyond his limits. It wasn't just about preparing food. It was about a survival system in a universe full of mysteries he had to uncover by himself. It was a victory of human instinct, a testament to the power of the species known as humankind. However, as he began to store his rations in a separate corner of the room, a strange loneliness crept over him. The jerky, though a source of survival, couldn't chase away the emptiness surrounding him. Every time he went outside to gather food, he could clearly feel the alienation from the crew. Their eyes, though they said nothing, were filled with suspicion. Those questioning glances, without a single word shared, made it feel as if he was no longer part of the group. He had been ostracized, not for wrongdoing, but for the choices he had made to survive. His eating habits, the raw meat, the bizarre meals from the killer beast, had unintentionally severed him from their world. They couldn't understand that, in order to survive, he had no choice but to make decisions that left him with no other option. Tom paused, holding a piece of jerky tightly, looking out the window where the vastness of space stretched out endlessly. Xylon, the strange planet where he had survived, now felt like a fading memory. He recalled the feeling of confusion when he first faced the killer beast, and the doubt that began to grow inside him as he consumed things he couldn't even understand. Yet, that victory had ignited a spark inside him. He had done it. He not only survived, but he had found a way to exist in a world where the rules of humanity no longer applied. Still, the price had been isolation. Even with enough food to survive, Tom knew he no longer had a place among the crew. The differences in his diet had pushed him into a strange, alienated position, an outsider. He had become a stranger in their eyes, not because of his actions, but because of the very nature of his humanity. In this alien world, could his survival ever truly align with an alien civilization? Or was all he could do survive, forever separated from acceptance? Tom's story was far from over. He looked at the bags of smoked meat he had prepared, reflecting on the doubts swirling in the crew's minds. And that question, an open-ended question, hung in the air. Could Tom's dietary differences be the key to humanity's survival when interacting with alien civilizations? Tom didn't have an answer, but he knew that question would continue to follow him throughout the long journey ahead.